Every evening at sunset, a shadow appears in the barn of Ashcroft Plantation, cast by nothing visible to the human eye. Patrick O'Brien discovered this impossibility on his third day as foreman, watching in horror as the dark silhouette stretched across the wooden floor despite the complete absence of any object that could create it. What he found beneath that cursed ground would reveal a systematic operation of human trafficking and mass murder that had claimed hundreds of lives over 5 blood-soaked years. But before we uncover the truth behind Patrick's terrifying discovery, I need to ask you something. If you're enjoying these dark mysteries that few dare to tell, please subscribe to our channel and hit that notification bell. And I'm curious, from which city and country are you listening to this story? Leave a comment below letting us know where you're from, and don't forget to give this video a like to help us bring more exclusive stories like this one. Now let me take you back to that cursed plantation in the territory of New Mexico, where the truth was far more horrifying than any ghost story. According to local chronicles and testimonies passed down through generations, what happened at Ashcroft Plantation remains one of the most disturbing chapters in the violent history of the American Southwest. In 1868, the territory of New Mexico was a harsh and lawless frontier, where justice was often decided by whoever held the fastest gun or the deepest pockets. 3 years after the Civil War's end, the region remained a dangerous crossroads where desperate men sought fortune through any means necessary. Santa Fe, the territorial capital, was growing rapidly as traders, miners, and settlers poured in from the east. But the surrounding countryside remained largely untamed. Ashcroft Plantation sat 15 miles southwest of Santa Fe, nestled in a valley where the Rio Grande's tributaries created surprisingly fertile soil. Unlike the grand cotton plantations of the Old South, this operation focused on cattle ranching and corn production, taking advantage of government contracts to supply nearby military outposts. The plantation sprawled across nearly 3,000 acres, with the main house perched on a hill overlooking vast fields that stretched toward the distant Sangre de Cristo Mountains. Samuel Ashcroft had arrived from Georgia in 1863, carrying enough gold to purchase the land and establish his operation. A tall, imposing man with steel-gray hair and cold blue eyes, he quickly gained a reputation for his business acumen and his ability to maintain large work crews when other ranchers struggled to find reliable labor. Local authorities praised his efficiency, and territorial officials often visited to study his methods. Patrick O'Brien stepped off the dusty stagecoach from Colorado Springs on March 15, 1868. Carrying nothing but a worn leather satchel and a letter of recommendation from his previous employer. The Irish immigrant had spent 5 years managing mining operations in the Colorado Territory, earning respect for his fair treatment of workers and his ability to maintain order without resorting to excessive violence. At 32, he was looking for a fresh start and the chance to build something lasting. Ashcroft met him personally at the Santa Fe depot, an unusual courtesy that Patrick found encouraging. During the long ride to the plantation, his new employer spoke enthusiastically about expansion plans and the profits to be made from government contracts. "The key to success out here," Ashcroft explained as their wagon bounced along the rutted road, "is maintaining a reliable workforce. Men drift away if you don't keep them satisfied and motivated." The plantation's main compound consisted of the 2-story adobe house, a large barn, several smaller outbuildings, and what appeared to be extensive worker quarters built in the Spanish colonial style. Patrick was impressed by the apparent prosperity. The buildings were well maintained, the livestock looked healthy, and the fields showed signs of careful cultivation. Everything seemed to indicate a thriving, legitimate operation. His first 2 days passed without incident, as Ashcroft introduced him to the foreman of various operations and explained the complex logistics of running such a large enterprise. The workers, Patrick noticed, were primarily Mexican families who spoke little English but appeared well-fed and adequately housed. They showed proper respect without the fearful deference he'd seen at poorly managed operations. On March 18th, as Patrick completed his evening inspection of the livestock, he witnessed something that defied all rational explanation. The sun was setting behind the western mountains, casting long shadows across the compound, when he approached the main barn to check on a mare that had seemed restless earlier. As he rounded the corner of the building, he stopped dead in his tracks. A human shadow, clearly defined and approximately 6 feet tall, stretched across the barn's wooden floor. Patrick looked around frantically for its source, a person, a post, anything that could cast such a shadow, but found nothing. The area around the barn was completely clear, with no objects tall enough to create the silhouette he was seeing. Even more disturbing, the shadow seemed to flicker slightly, as if the invisible figure casting it was moving. Patrick rubbed his eyes, certain that exhaustion or the strange light of the desert sunset was playing tricks on him. But when he looked again, the shadow remained, darker and more distinct than any natural shadow should be. He walked around the barn's perimeter, searching for an explanation, but the shadow's position made no sense with the sun's angle or any possible obstruction. As full darkness fell, the shadow gradually faded, leaving Patrick questioning his own sanity. He said nothing to Ashcroft that evening, hoping that a good night's sleep would restore his confidence in what he had and hadn't seen. But as he lay in his small room, adjacent to the main house, he found himself staring out the window toward the barn, wondering what other impossible things might be happening in the darkness. The next evening, Patrick positioned himself near the barn well before sunset, determined to solve the mystery. As the sun began its descent, he watched the ground intently, and once again the shadow appeared at precisely the same location. This time, he was close enough to observe details that made his blood run cold. The shadow had the distinct outline of a person with arms raised as if pleading or trying to ward off some threat. He knelt and examined the wooden floor where the shadow fell. The boards in that specific area seemed darker than the surrounding wood, as if they had been stained by something that had soaked deep into the grain. When he ran his fingers across the surface, the wood felt different, slightly soft and porous, with an odd texture that reminded him of something he couldn't quite identify. That night, Patrick approached Miguel Santos, one of the few workers who spoke reasonable English. Miguel had been at the plantation for almost 2 years and seemed to be trusted by the other workers. Patrick found him smoking behind the worker quarters after the evening meal. "Miguel, I need to ask you something," Patrick began carefully. "Have you ever noticed anything unusual about the main barn?" Miguel's expression immediately changed. The friendly openness disappeared, replaced by a wariness that bordered on fear. He glanced around nervously before responding in a low voice. "Senor O'Brien, there are some things it is better not to see, some things it is better not to know." "What do you mean by that?" "The barn. It has a shadow that should not be there. We all see it, but we do not speak of it. Senor Ashcroft, he does not like questions about the barn." Miguel's hands were shaking as he spoke. "My advice, senor, is to do your job and ask no questions. Men who ask too many questions about the barn, they go away." Miguel's words haunted Patrick through the following week, but his curiosity only intensified as he began noticing other strange details about the plantation's operation. The worker population seemed to fluctuate significantly. New faces would appear for a few weeks, then disappear without explanation. When Patrick asked Ashcroft about the turnover, his employer simply shrugged and mentioned that frontier life doesn't suit everyone. More troubling was the pattern of nighttime activity that Patrick observed from his window. 2 or 3 times a week, he would be awakened by the sound of wagons arriving or departing in the darkness. The vehicles always seemed to stop near the barn, and he could hear men's voices speaking in urgent, hushed tones. By morning, there would be no sign of any unusual activity, but Patrick began to notice that these nocturnal visits often coincided with changes in the worker population. The shadow continued to appear every evening, and Patrick became obsessed with understanding its meaning. He began keeping a detailed journal, recording the exact time of its appearance, its size and shape, and any variations he observed. What emerged was a pattern of disturbing consistency. The shadow always appeared at the same location, always had the same general human outline, and always seemed to be reaching upward or outward in what appeared to be a gesture of desperation. During his second week at the plantation, Patrick encountered a new worker named Carlos Mendoza, a middle-aged man with intelligent eyes and calloused hands that spoke of years of hard labor. Unlike the other workers, Carlos seemed eager to talk, perhaps because he was still adjusting to his new situation and hadn't yet learned the unspoken rules that governed the plantation. "How long have you been here, Carlos?" Patrick asked during a break in the day's work. "Only 3 days, senor. I came with my family from a village near Albuquerque. We were told there was good work here, fair wages, and safe housing for our children." Carlos paused, looking around uncertainly. "But something feels wrong here. The other workers, they look at us with pity, not welcome. And my wife, she says she hears crying at night coming from the direction of the barn." Patrick felt his stomach tighten. "What kind of crying?" "She says it sounds like many voices all crying together, but when we look out our window we see nothing. The other women in our building, they tell her to ignore it, that it is only the wind. But my wife, she knows the difference between wind and human sorrow." That evening, Patrick watched the shadow appear as usual, but this time he forced himself to stay near the barn even after darkness fell. As midnight approached, he heard it. A low, mournful sound that might have been wind through the buildings, but carried an unmistakably human quality. The sound seemed to come from beneath the barn itself, as if the earth was moaning. The breakthrough came during Patrick's third week, when he discovered Ashcroft's true business model through a series of overheard conversations and careful observation. Late one evening, as he worked in the plantation's small office updating inventory records, he heard voices approaching from outside. Quickly extinguishing his lamp, he moved to the window and saw Ashcroft talking with 2 men he didn't recognize, rough-looking individuals with the bearing of professional criminals. "The next shipment should be ready within a week," Ashcroft was saying. 15 adults, 6 children, all healthy, all broken in properly. Your buyers shouldn't have any trouble with them." One of the strangers replied, "And the ones who are no longer useful, taken care of as usual. The barn serves multiple purposes, as you know. Nothing goes to waste." Ashcroft's laugh was cold and calculating. "The territorial authorities are quite pleased with our employment of local labor. They have no idea how local that labor really is." Patrick felt his blood freeze as the implications became clear. Ashcroft wasn't just running a plantation, he was operating a slave market, trafficking kidnapped Mexican families and disposing of those who became too old, sick, or rebellious to be profitable. The shadow in the barn wasn't supernatural at all. It was marking the site of mass murder. Over the next few days, Patrick began paying closer attention to the workers' conversations and gradually pieced together the horrifying scope of the operation. Families were lured from their villages with promises of honest work and fair wages. Upon arrival, they were confined to the plantation under armed guard and forced to work without pay. Those who proved tractable were eventually sold to buyers throughout the territory, while those who resisted or became unable to work simply disappeared. The older workers lived in constant terror, knowing that their usefulness had an expiration date. The newer arrivals, like Carlos and his family, hadn't yet realized the trap they had fallen into. Patrick estimated that dozens of people had vanished from the plantation over the past year alone, and the operation had been running for at least 5 years. Miguel Santos confirmed Patrick's suspicions during a carefully arranged conversation behind the equipment shed. "You have figured it out, haven't you, Senor O'Brien?" he said without preamble. "You know what happens here." "How many people have been killed?" Patrick asked directly. Miguel's eyes filled with tears. "I have been here since the beginning. I have seen hundreds of my people murdered when they were no longer profitable. The barn, it sits on top of a place where no grass will ever grow again. Armed with this knowledge, Patrick faced an impossible choice. If he tried to contact the territorial authorities, Ashcroft's connections with government officials would likely result in Patrick's own disappearance before any investigation could begin. If he attempted to flee and report the crimes from a safe distance, dozens more people would die while bureaucrats debated jurisdiction and evidence. His decision was made for him when he discovered that Carlos Mendoza's family had been selected for the next shipment. Patrick overheard two of Ashcroft's armed overseers discussing logistics for transporting the new merchandise to buyers in Colorado Territory. Carlos, his wife, and their two young children would be sold within days, separated forever and condemned to lives of brutality and exploitation. That night, Patrick made his way to the barn, determined to gather concrete evidence of the murders that had taken place there. Using a small knife, he pried up several of the stained floorboards where the shadow appeared each evening. Beneath the boards, the earth was black and soft, with an unmistakable smell of decomposition that had been masked but not eliminated by lime and other chemicals. As he dug deeper, his worst fears were confirmed. The soil was mixed with bone fragments, scraps of clothing, and other human remains. The barn wasn't just built over a burial site. It was constructed specifically to conceal a mass grave that had been in use for years. The shadow was nothing more than an optical illusion created by the different density and color of the disturbed earth, which absorbed and reflected light differently than the surrounding ground. But Patrick's investigation was interrupted by the sound of approaching footsteps. He quickly replaced the boards and hid behind a stack of hay bales as two men entered the barn. One was Ashcroft himself, and the other was a stranger with the hard look of a professional killer. "The Irish foreman is becoming problematic," Ashcroft was saying. "He's been asking too many questions and spending too much time around the barn. I think it's time for him to have an accident." "How do you want it handled?" the other man asked. "Make it look like he was kicked by a horse or fell from the hayloft. Something believable that won't attract attention. The territorial marshal is scheduled to visit next week, and I don't want any complications." Patrick remained hidden until the men left, his heart pounding as he realized that his life was now in immediate danger. But more than his own safety, he was tormented by the knowledge that Carlos's family and dozens of other innocent people were depending on someone taking action against this monstrous operation. The next morning brought a crisis that forced Patrick to act immediately. He awoke to find the plantation in an uproar. Carlos Mendoza had attempted to escape during the night with his family, but had been captured before reaching the main road. Ashcroft's men had dragged them back to the compound, and now the entire family was being held in a storage building, pending disciplinary action. Patrick knew that disciplinary action meant death, and that the Mendoza family would soon join the hundreds of victims buried beneath the barn. He also knew that his own window of survival was rapidly closing. Ashcroft's assassin could strike at any moment, and once Patrick was dead, there would be no one left to expose the truth. With desperate courage born of moral outrage, Patrick made his way to the worker quarters and sought out Miguel Santos and the other long-term survivors. "Tonight, we end this," he told them bluntly. "Tonight, we save the Mendoza family and escape to Santa Fe, where we can bring the territorial marshal back with enough soldiers to shut down this operation permanently." Miguel shook his head sadly. "Senor, you do not understand. Many have tried to escape. None have succeeded. Ashcroft has agreements with bandits throughout the territory. They hunt down runaways and bring them back for bounties. And even if we reach Santa Fe, who would believe us against a man like Ashcroft? They'll believe us when we show them what's buried under the barn," Patrick replied. I've gathered physical evidence, bone fragments, personal effects, enough proof to demand a full investigation, but we need to move tonight, before Ashcroft kills the Mendoza family and before his assassin kills me. The escape attempt began at midnight, with Patrick and 8 workers moving silently through the compound toward the building where the Mendoza family was imprisoned. Patrick had observed the guard rotations and identified a brief window when the storage building would be unobserved. But as they approached their destination, they walked directly into an ambush. Ashcroft and 6 armed men emerged from concealment, surrounding the would-be rescuers with rifles and pistols. "I had hoped you might prove more intelligent than this, O'Brien," Ashcroft said calmly. "But it seems you're determined to interfere with my business operations." "Your business operations?" Patrick spat. "You mean kidnapping, slavery, and mass murder?" Ashcroft shrugged. "I prefer to think of it as efficient resource management. The territorial government wants productive citizens and economic development. I provide both by putting idle Mexican peasants to productive use and disposing of those who cannot contribute to society's progress." "You're a monster," one of the workers said in broken English. "I'm a businessman," Ashcroft corrected, "and you are all unfortunate complications that require permanent resolution." What Ashcroft hadn't anticipated was that Patrick's desperate plan included a backup element. Before attempting the rescue, Patrick had written a detailed account of everything he'd discovered and hidden it in the plantation's main office, along with the bone fragments and other evidence he'd collected. More importantly, he had convinced Miguel to send his oldest son to Santa Fe with a message for the territorial marshal, warning that if Patrick and the other workers didn't arrive in town by noon the following day, a full investigation of Ashcroft Plantation should be launched immediately. The mass execution that Ashcroft planned for that night never took place. Just as his men were preparing to march their prisoners to the barn, the thunder of approaching horses announced the arrival of a cavalry detachment led by Territorial Marshal James Morrison. Miguel's son had indeed reached Santa Fe, and his story had been compelling enough to prompt immediate action. The subsequent investigation revealed the full scope of Ashcroft's operation. Excavation beneath the barn uncovered the remains of over 200 victims, along with personal belongings that helped identify many of the families who had disappeared over the previous 5 years. Documents found in Ashcroft's office detailed his network of kidnappers and buyers, leading to arrests throughout the territory. Ashcroft himself was tried and executed for crimes against humanity, becoming one of the first men in the territory of New Mexico to be convicted under federal anti-slavery statutes. His co-conspirators received similar fates, and the plantation was seized by territorial authorities and eventually distributed to legitimate settlers. Patrick O'Brien survived his ordeal and was commended by territorial officials for his courage in exposing the operation. He remained in New Mexico, eventually establishing his own ranch and becoming a respected member of the community. Miguel Santos and the other survivors were granted full citizenship and assistance in establishing new lives, though many bore psychological scars that never fully healed. The shadow that had first alerted Patrick to the barn's sinister purpose continued to appear for several months after the investigation, but gradually faded as the mass grave was properly excavated and the victims were given decent burial in consecrated ground. Local residents reported that the area eventually returned to normal, with grass growing naturally and no trace of the horrors that had once been concealed there. This case demonstrates how evil can hide behind a facade of respectability and prosperity, and how the courage of individuals willing to risk everything for justice can expose even the most carefully concealed crimes. The victims of Ashcroft Plantation were finally given the dignity and death that had been denied them in their final days of life. Just when we think we've seen the depths of human cruelty, stories like this remind us that evil often wears a mask of legitimacy and success. If this story has given you chills and made you think about the hidden horrors that might exist behind closed doors, please share this video with someone who appreciates dark historical mysteries. Give it a like to support our research into these forgotten crimes, and don't forget to subscribe so you don't miss more stories that reveal the truth behind America's darkest secrets. The story of Ashcroft Plantation shows us that sometimes the most terrifying monsters are not supernatural entities, but human beings who view other people as commodities to be bought, sold, and discarded. The shadow in the barn was not cast by a ghost, but by the collective weight of hundreds of murders that stained the very ground with innocent blood. What do you think about this disturbing chapter in American history? Do you believe that such operations could have existed without official knowledge or complicity? Leave your thoughts in the comments below and tell us what other dark historical mysteries you'd like us to investigate. If you enjoyed this deep dive into America's hidden past, subscribe to our channel, activate notifications, and share this story with others who aren't afraid to confront uncomfortable truths about our history. Until next time, remember that the past is never as distant as we might wish it to be.